I think Curb is probably my favorite show of all time, certainly my favorite comedy, and it's got staying power. It's been on for what, almost 20 years. I know they take breaks, but huge fan of that show and his work. And I always thought he and Larry's dynamic was great together. I've also kind of dove into the behind the scenes of Curb, where Larry will talk about how they script the show with an outline, but they don't really have a script. And he said that Richard was the one guy that would always want to know the script, so he could kind of come in with some pre-written jokes with which Larry didn't like. So I thought that dynamic was funny. And then also, you've seen some of these clips. What I love about Curb is when they are improving and ad-libbing, and they genuinely make each other laugh. And you can tell some of the exchanges between Larry and Richard Lewis where they're kind of going off the cuff, and you can tell their laughter is genuine. That's what I find really interesting.
I go back to Richard Lewis being on Letterman, like when I was a kid, and you would look, I think you would look in the paper and it would list who was on that night, like on Letterman's show. And if it was Jerry Seinfeld or Jay Leno or Richard Lewis, like those young comedians, you would tune in to see them because they always brought something. And this is, it's kind of like the Jim Rome, have a take, don't suck. When you have a guest on your podcast, your radio, you hate it if they mail it in. And those guys would always show up. Leno was great at that too. I wasn't as big a fan later on, but when he would come on Letterman, he always had a bit. He was funny. And Richard would always just like torment with Dave. I got to find some of those clips. I could spend all day doing this. But he would do stuff like, Dave, get the camera. I don't want to look at the camera. I don't want to be seen. And Dave was like, well, it's kind of tricky. We're a TV show. We need a camera. And like, I just loved Richard Lewis back then. He was so neurotic. He was Woody Allen, but funnier. You know, I like Woody Allen, but he wasn't overly funny. He was a great movie maker, filmmaker, whatever. But like Richard Lewis had that same kind of neurotic vibe, and I didn't know he was sick. I guess he had Parkinson's, right? That recently Parkinson's thing had a heart attack. Larry's comment yesterday that I read, he said Richard Lewis had the ability to be the funniest guy in the room and the sweetest. And he said, but now he said, now you've made me cry and I will never forgive you. And it sounded like Larry was like genuinely mad at him, which sounds like something Larry would say, but also maybe some real emotion. Like you can't picture Larry David being sad, can you? You can't picture him like at a funeral for Richard Lewis. I picture Larry, instead of sobbing, missing his friend, I picture him saying, why are they parking the cars over there? They shouldn't be parked. Like, can you imagine him actually being normal and serious?
Well, it's funny you say that because I actually thought of that same thing when I heard the news and I saw that same quote that you're talking about. And obviously, this is the last season of Curb. Now, you never know. Could they come back? And I think this is something, even though it's a death and it's very sad. I mean, these are comedians and their life was humor. To me, I mean, the perfect way would, I don't know if you have to do a whole nother season, but like, I feel like Larry David could perfectly do an episode of Curb based on Richard Lewis actually dying and having the funeral, and that could be a story arc, and it would be a great way to show and pay tribute to Richard Lewis, but also be really funny, which you'd think, look, Richard Lewis would probably want it that way, right?
Yeah, I could see that too. I don't. I mean, the fact that the show's over or is ending, I'm like, why? They could come back in 5 years and say it's still.
Yeah.
Like, it debuted in 2000. It's been on for 24 years, but it doesn't feel like it's really been on that long because they would just disappear. When it first got going, my dad liked Seinfeld, but my dad was really picky about comedy and like you and I always talk about who do we like in media, and you always say, oh, Martin hates everybody. I think I got that from my dad because he didn't like any comedians, but he liked Seinfeld. So I went out to his house in Denver and I bought the box set of Kirby Enthusiasm, like the first box set they put out. And Kim and I were out there, my wife now dating then. We went skiing for the weekend. So I said to my dad, oh, this is great. I got you this box set of Larry David. So we come back after the weekend and we're going to the airport and he gives it back to me. And he said, I just can't do it. He said, it made me so uncomfortable. And I'm like, I think some people are that way with Larry David that it makes them uncomfortable, which reminds me of, and you would have probably been there. It was a Rams pregame show. This is 2008, Glory Days. Well, you really came in during the Glory Days. You think about how
Oh
far
yeah.
You came in, LaRussa was still the manager. The Rams
Mhm.
were still here. Linehan was the head coach. This is a while ago.
Mhm.
But during that 2008 season, at some point, Chip and Lucian, the owners were Georgia's kids. And Chip Rosenblum is real big on the environment, activist, and he's a filmmaker. Somehow they got word to us that they wanted Larry David's wife on the pregame show. She was in town promoting a movie about the environment. It, we got to find the footage. Jober, our great producer, Dave Job, probably has it somewhere on a VHS. On the Rams pregame show was Larry David's wife in real life and RFK Jr., the guy running for president.
Really?
100%. Because I remember I got emails that week, people pissed off, like, because it was about the environment. So all these people were mad. And they said, "What are you doing on a sports show, Kilborn? You're putting these wackos from California on your show. You should be talking football." And I'm like, "Listen, asshat, the team's 2-10. Like, who cares? Who cares?" But in the interview, I remember we would always have the desk. Nowadays, everybody
Mhm.
just like you and I are sitting on a Zoom, or like AJ Hawk always looks like a prisoner of war on that McAfee show. But back then, we actually had a set. Remember, we'd have that giant table. They would roll it out
Mhm.
there. God bless our engineers. But sitting on that set, I remember saying to Larry David's wife, "I got to ask, because I'm like, you are here and you're married to Larry David." And I said, "He seems pretty weird." And she said, "You have no idea." She said, "He's exactly like the show in real life." And I think that's probably true. Like, as uncomfortable as it made my dad, and sometimes even watching, I love it, but sometimes I get uncomfortable with the topics or the situation. Uh, that's 100% who he was.
What I find so great about the show, and I've also heard Larry say that the show is basically him. It's inside his brain if he really had no social decorum whatsoever. So in real life, he thinks these things, but he obviously doesn't act out on all of them like he does for the show. But what I find so great about that show is everything he does, there's certainly a kernel to truth to all of that. Like every little thing about, maybe your neighbors, like, your leaves go into their yard or vice versa, or the garbage, all those little idiosyncrasies of life. Or like you said, parking, you're in a parking spot, you go there, somebody goes in line, they hold the door, then they go in front of you at the coffee shop. All of those things really happen to all of us all the time in our daily lives. And they're kind of tweeners. You're like, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to act in those situations? And he perfectly puts them all into this story and makes it hilarious.
And the most recent one I saw, when he starts screaming at Siri, and he's like, "Listen, you fucking bitch, I don't want to go there." And I do that. I scream anything that's voice communicated, where it'll say like, "Why don't you enter your password?" "I don't know my password." And Kim will find me screaming at my phone saying, "Assistant, human, person, I want to speak to somebody." Like, that happens to me 3 times
Hmm.
a week. And he just went nuts on that Siri. He's just screaming at Siri because they don't understand. I just want to talk to a freaking human being sometimes.
Okay, so one of the episodes that I remember that I always think about, I don't remember exactly how it went down, but remember they're going into the bathroom and the handicap stall is open and the other stall isn't. So there's nobody waiting. So Larry jumps in the handicap, but then a guy comes behind him in a wheelchair. But then part of the story was also like somebody had a stutter, and Larry thought the person that had a stutter shouldn't get a handicap parking spot. And then at the end of the episode, Larry pretended to have a stutter. But again, so I have two kids now, and you have to help them in the bathroom and all that. So you'll go into a bathroom and you try to always go to the handicap because it's the biggest one. You're helping your kid. And I'm telling you, every time I go into a bathroom, if I choose the handicap stall, if nobody's there, you're trying to figure out. But I always think of that episode of Curb.
Yeah, I think what it is we all have Larry David moments where awkward shit happens, where the person in the parking lot, that you give them one of these, like they take your spot and you're like mad, and then you walk into Starbucks and they're standing in front of you, or like you need their help at a later, like the person that you have some confrontation with always is that person later that you either are standing next to or you need their assistance. Or anyway, I love Curb.